3. Seema's work focuses on how identities are constructed and mobilized in the English-speaking world. Madame Patricia Fournier Noël's own research looks into the education system, especially at the primary level, and minorities in the Republic of Ireland. Over to you, Madame Patricia Fournier Noël.
And maybe we'll introduce Barbara just before. We'll be speaking next. She's a senior lecturer in Irish Studies at Toulouse Capitole University, and her research focuses on immigration and integration policy, as well as on the reception of refugees and asylum seekers in the Republic of Ireland. And the talk today is entitled Balancing Acts, Protests, Policies, and the Evolving Landscape of Asylum Seeker Reception in Ireland. Okay, thanks. So over to you, Patricia.
Thank you very much. All right, so I'm just going to share my screen before I start and hope it works. Is it working properly?
Yeah, it is.
Perfect. Right, so migrations are a long-standing phenomenon in Ireland, but for most of the decades before and after independence in 1922, emigration was the overwhelmingly dominant form of migration. However, as you already know, I suppose, immigration became more significant towards the end of the 20th century and overtook immigration for the first time in the 1990s. This shift in migration patterns has had an impact on the Irish education system, most particularly at the primary level, which generally constitutes the first point of contact migrant children and their families have with the formal education system. The Irish National School System, which was founded in 1831 at the time of the union between Great Britain and Ireland, relied on a partnership, if we can call it like that, it's probably anachronistic, but a partnership between the state and the churches. The state subsidized schools, but schools remained the property and responsibility of a school patron, who was a representative either of the Roman Catholic Church, the Church of Ireland, which is the Anglican Church in Ireland, or other Protestant denominations, mostly Presbyterians. And so obviously the system has evolved since then, but this arrangement has endured to a large extent even after independence, which means that the vast majority of primary schools are denominational Catholic schools today. Two issues have stood out over the last decades in relation to migration and primary schooling in Ireland. The first one focuses on the experience of migrant pupils in Irish primary schools, including instances of racism, so both their experience and difficulties in everyday life at school. And so one example is Divine 2011. And the other important issue that has taken center stage over recent years is the broader issue of religious discrimination and secularism, because there's a broader movement in Irish society with an increase in the number of Irish citizens who define themselves as having no religion. And so this has an impact on migrants as well. So you have more publications on that issue, and I've quoted 3 of the most important, most significant and recent ones here. Right, so what I'd like to do today is give you, I suppose, a general overview of those issues and try to analyze to what extent official education policies have moved from a specific or targeted approach regarding immigrant pupils at primary level to a more mainstream one. And I've been using an article by Sholton, Collett and Petrovic, published in 2017, which is entitled Mainstream Migrant Integration, a Critical Analysis of a New Trend in Integration Governance. And I thought it was interesting. So what they were trying to do was to adapt the mainstreaming concept, which was used in other areas before, to migrant integration policies. And they use 2 aspects of this concept. One is a shift in policy focus, so from specific to generic, and And the second one, which is a shift in governance from state-centric to polycentric. I will focus more on the first element, so the shift in policies from specific or targeted policies to more mainstream ones. But there are elements of governance that could be explored later on, but I'm going to focus on the first aspect today. So I would like to start with some quick context information about immigration to Ireland and primary schooling, just to set the general picture. And then I'll focus on contemporary legislative and curricular frameworks for migrant pupils. And lastly, I will discuss the Irish approach to specific education policies. So just to give you some figures, I'll try not to dwell too long on them. So just because it's interesting, it's the first time. So there's a census in Ireland every 5 years. The last one was postponed because of COVID, of course. So, and the results have been published in 2023. So there's recent statistics on Ireland. And what's interesting is the first time 2022 that Ireland has, the population has gone over the 5 million mark. And it's the first time since the 19th century and the aftermath of the Irish famine. It's just to see the evolution, and also to show that immigration has been a bigger issue for Ireland for most of the 20th century, and immigration is a fairly recent concern. All right, just to show you the evolutions and see, for example, that still economic crises have an impact on migration in Ireland as in other places. And here you can see that in the 1990s, you had an economic crisis, which meant that immigration started to grow strong again after a period of immigration in the 1970s, which you cannot see there, but you have the results in 1981. And also after the financial crisis in 2008, there was also an increase in emigration from Ireland, as well as a decrease in immigration, as you can see for the period 2011-2016. It's mostly natural increase, but net migration is negative over that period. But immigration is on the increase again. All right, just so some summary results from the latest census. So the population is increasing, and you have 12% of non-Irish citizens, which is quite a significant number for a country that didn't have a history of immigration, such as Ireland. It's fairly similar to the previous census in 2016, but has grown since the 1990s. So it's a fairly significant amount for Ireland, and 2% of dual Irish citizens. Roman Catholicism is still the majority religion, but it's less prevalent than it used to be, and there's a very significant increase in citizens who declare that they have no religion. So 14% and 69% for those who say they are Catholic. All right, if we look at non-Irish citizens, I just placed 2011 and 2022 so that you could have a point of comparison. What's interesting is that you still have a high proportion from the UK, and also it's mostly EU migrants. In the 2000s was mostly Poland and new EU countries that constituted the bulk of new migrants to Ireland and Irish schools in particular. And so you have the rest of Europe in orange, Africa in blue. Usually the biggest group would have been from Nigeria. But you had a huge diversity in origin countries or home countries. And so Asia, the Americas, so you have migrants from the US who are also a significant part of migration to Ireland, and then other citizenships. So it hasn't changed that much. Maybe there's an increase from Asia. That would be the most notable point, maybe less migrants from the UK, but still a significant part. Right, in terms of religion, so you still have 2/3 of the population who declare that they're Roman Catholics. And if you look at the younger age group, so here you can see that it's approximately the same. You have 65% whose parents declared that they were Roman Catholic, and 16% had no religion, 3% were Muslim. If you look at the first years of primary school, so 5 to 9 years age, because you start primary school at age 4 in Ireland, And so you have a higher proportion of Roman Catholic, which means maybe the next cohort will show a decrease in Roman Catholicism as well. So 72% of children were declared as Roman Catholic by their parents, 11% had no religion, 3% were Muslim, and 3% were Church of Ireland or Anglican, generally speaking. And so that shows the main religious minorities that you can find in primary schools in Ireland. Like the majority of children would be Roman Catholic. You have children who have no religion, a significant Muslim group, and then Anglican children. And then you can have very small numbers of children from different religious denominations. Right, as regards the education system, contrary to England and Wales, it's fairly centralized. And I've just put the different names. So I'm going to stick to Department of Education, but basically for a few decades, it had an S in its name. So first science and then skills. But it's gone back to the original name, Department of Education. So I will just use the name Department of Education just to make it simpler. So there's been an increasing but limited diversification in primary school religious and linguistic profiles. I come back to this. So you now have since the late 1970s, you have an emerging multi-denominational school sector that tries to meet the demands, the parental demands for more, for an alternative to denominational education. And then in terms of education policies, it's interesting to compare with other minorities. So I'm going to focus on migrants today mostly, but it's interesting to see that there are transfers between different groups or policies adopted for different groups that are then applied to another group. So for example, travelers are an indigenous minority in Ireland. They're the nomadic group in Ireland. And you have a few, around 40,000 travelers. I haven't checked the latest figure. But the original policy in the 1960s was assimilation. And there were reports saying that traveler children did not attend school or did not attend school regularly. And so in the 1970s, some special schools for travelers were created and some special classes for traveler children within mainstream schools. So some kind of targeted intervention whose purpose at the time was assimilation more than integration, as it later was for migrants. And it's interesting that in the 1990s, there was a mainstreaming of traveler education with specific support, and that special schools were progressively closed. And the idea was to integrate travelers into mainstream classrooms, but keeping specific support to help them integrate into the mainstream school system. And the same happened over approximately, the 1990s is a key period in Ireland for change and reforms. And the same happened for special needs education. You still have special schools in Ireland, but it's a European trend, or probably an international or worldwide trend as well, to include more special needs pupils into mainstream schools. And so that has happened over the same time period. So now you have more special needs children in mainstream classes, and they're entitled to specific support or sometimes special classes in mainstream schools if their level of disability is higher, if they need more support than they can get in a mainstream context with just a few support hours. As regards the schools themselves, as I mentioned before, they're still mostly denominational schools, and traditionally in Ireland, the local school is the local Catholic school. And parents who did not wish their children to attend the Catholic school had, for some of them, the opportunity, or what they did was they went to the Church of Ireland school. So traditionally, the Church of Ireland would have been, in a way, a multi-denominational school de facto, not by choice, but it was the only alternative if parents didn't want their children to attend the Catholic school. And in the Church of Ireland schools, sacrament preparations is organized outside of school hours, so there's probably less of a denominational element, even if it's not absent, still part of their ethos of characteristic spirit. And so you have a few Presbyterian schools, but that's an inheritance from the 19th century. They're most of them located in the north, so they're close to Ulster, and they're in Ulster and close to Northern Ireland. You have one Methodist school in Dublin. It's also inheritance from the past. The Quaker school isn't a creation. It was a private school, and it's transferred to the public sector. So as I mentioned before, the public sector is actually semi-public or semi-private, as you want to put it, which means that it's mostly funded by the state, but schools are private institutions and are managed by or they're under the authority of a school patron. And usually those are, well, the religious denominations mentioned here. There's been a Jewish school since the 1930s, so it means that even though Ireland was a country of immigration, you still you've had immigration for a very long time. It's just that the numbers were much lower than what they were in the 1990s. So the Jewish school has been established for over 100 years in Dublin. And the Muslim schools are more recent. The first one, you have two. The first one was created in 1990. You've had a Muslim community in Ireland at least since the 1960s, 1970s. And so the first school was created before the increase in immigration of the mid-1990s. And then a second school was created in 2001, 2002, so in the early 2000s. And then interdenominational usually refers to something I will not focus too much on today, which is the Irish language school sector. So you have a number, originally you had schools where Irish was the medium of instruction because they were located in the west of Ireland where you still had Irish as a first language. But there's been a growth since the 1970s of Irish language schools where the medium of instruction is English, but not necessarily because it's in English-speaking, Irish-speaking area, sorry, but because it's parental demand for Irish language education. And so some of them were set up as a joint venture between Catholic and Church of Ireland authorities, so they're called interdenominational. The same happens with some of the multi-denominational schools. You have three types of schools in there. You have Irish language schools. You have a new type of school which was set up in 1978, which are now called Educate Together School, and so they were set up by parents who managed to get one school recognized by the Department of Education, and then have been able to grow the system, and with the more recent support of the Department of Education, which wasn't the case initially, but they've had more support since the 2000s. And a new model, but I won't go too much into this, which is the new fully public model through the education and training boards, which are regional authorities, and in the past only had authority over vocational education. And so this has been a means to set up new schools via regional education and training boards that are under the responsibility of the Department of Education. And so there's been an alternative model to the one that was set up by parents in the 1970s, and this is a growing sector as well. So as you can see, the number of multi-denominational schools has increased greatly since 2000. So that's the general context in which migrants come. All right, one specific criterion that was used by the Department of Education to decide for or to put in place some targeted support for migrant children was whether they were English speakers or not, or native speakers of English. And so you have here for more recent years the number of children whose mother tongue was not English. So those are statistics compiled by the Department of Education, because as I will mention later on, they provide some English language support, and so schools have to state how many pupils are in need of this support, which means when I did my my PhD research in the late 2000s, there were no statistics, and so one of the indicators I used to find schools where I could study the accommodation of migrant pupils was whether the schools had language support teachers for English for migrants, and now this has become public. They published the number of pupils that receive language support in different schools. And so it's broadly around 50,000 pupils if you look at the figures over the past year, so from 2017 to 2022. So it's about 9% of the school population, but that's not to say that they're evenly spread. You have schools who have a much higher number of migrant children, and schools who do not have any or have very, very few numbers. It's just to give a rough idea of the number of pupils who need at least language support in primary schools. Right, so I wanted to start first with the legislative framework. So the Education Act 1998 showed support for denominational schools. There was no reform there. It's just it enshrined the existing system into law. Then the Equal Status Act forbids discrimination on different grounds, including religion. But denominational schools had an exemption as part of that equality legislation, which meant that if they didn't have enough places for all applicants, they were allowed to discriminate on religious grounds to maintain ethos. So ethos is their characteristic spirit. And so they could argue that because there were denominational schools, they had the right to give priority to pupils belonging to the same denomination as that of the school. And I'm mentioning that because that has caused discrimination issues for migrants who were not Catholic. In that, if you apply those rules, then those who are refused school places are very likely to be migrants. And so that happened in 2007. So you had a crisis in Dublin, both in North Dublin and West Dublin, which were areas where you had a significant number of migrants who had found accommodation there. And so you had two crises in September, Bairbre, so in North Dublin and West Dublin, Dublin 15, where you had migrants who didn't have school. And so two emergency schools were open. So in North Dublin, Educate Together, so the multi-denominational school umbrella body opened one in emergency. And in Dublin 15, the Catholic Church opened an emergency school, but it was later transferred to the new community national school model, which is the one supported by the Department of Education and managed by the regional education and training boards. And finally, so this has led to a lot of debate in the media and among, and also to among researchers. And so in 2018, this was changed, and a new law, so the Education Admission to Schools Act 2018, ended the exemption from religious discrimination for Catholic schools. So they're not allowed to use denomination as a priority anymore. But the exemption still exists for minority denominational schools. So that is to say the Jewish school, the two Muslim schools, and the Church of Ireland and Presbyterian schools. They can still use a religion because they're minority denominational schools. And so it's a way of acknowledging the fact that in practice, the Catholic school, although it's denominational, is the local school in many areas in Ireland and should be accessible to the local population. So this is supposed to allow better access to schools to migrants, especially migrants of a different religion or who are not Catholic. So that's for the general legislation. In terms of the curriculum, as part of the Education Act that I've just mentioned, a new council was established for the curriculum, so the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment. And so they published a revised primary school curriculum in 1999. But it's the same as for the 1998 Education Act. Migrants do not appear as such, right? So it's there's only in the introduction a reference to the fact that schools should promote tolerance and respect for diversity, but it's only at the general level, more in that specifically targets migrants. So it's still with a mainstream policy. And then, so in the early 2000s, you had the development of intercultural education, which was partly because there was EU funding, so European funding for this. And partly to differentiate from multiculturalism in Britain. And so intercultural education was chosen in preference, I suppose, to multiculturalism, although you could see common points that there was a respect for diversity and an anti-racist dimension. And so what's interesting is that that approach was first introduced for travelers and then extended to migrants. And so in 2002, you had the publication of guidelines on traveler education in primary schools, which recommended an intercultural approach. Now, you had the same guidelines for secondary schools. I'm focusing on primary schools today because that's my area of research, but very often you have parallel guidelines for primary and secondary schools. And same applies to intercultural education in the primary school. So just to show you that it was inspired, it was first tested on travelers and then extended to migrant children. And this was pursued then with the intercultural education strategy. And so intercultural education is interesting in that it's both something that takes migrant needs into account, but is designed as a mainstream framework that intercultural education is for everyone and not just for migrants. Now, what happened with this is that the guidelines were published, but teachers weren't really trained. And so there's a question as to what extent it was really implemented in the school. But that was the official framework, or those were the official guidelines from the Department of Education in terms of their integration model for migrants, but also for society at large and all our pupils, no matter their background. And so it's taken a few years to roll out the 1999 curriculum. So teachers were trained subject by subject, year after year. So it took, it was fully implemented in the late 2000s. And so then, since then, there have been discussions as to a new primary curriculum. There's been a consultation process, etc. And we've reached the end almost of this process. And so the general framework has been published for the new primary curriculum, but work is still ongoing to publish the guidelines for the different subjects in the curriculum. But what's interesting in terms of migrants is that we can see that there's been a move away from targeted measures, in that migrants have been you had different categories. Like for special needs pupils, the official term was inclusion, and for migrants, the term that was used in Ireland was integration. Right, and you can see a conflation of the two categories here, is that now they're in the same category, so inclusive education and diversity. And it's probably a way of mainstreaming migrant education, as well as special needs in the way that special needs education has been mainstreamed. And so it's kind of a move away from intercultural education or anti-racism that are not mentioned at all. And the focus is more on inclusion and well-being. So well-being, I think, has been used in Britain as well, is a new concept. I haven't really researched it, so I'm not sure where it emanates from. But it has replaced in Ireland the what used to be called social, personal, and health education. And because of the social element of this subject, you had discussions in this potentially about identity, racism, anti-racism, etc. And so I suppose the fact that it's been replaced by well-being, which probably has more of a health connotation, is likely to mean a move away from that social aspect in that area of the curriculum. But this has to be confirmed. It's just what the change in terminology seems to imply. And something that's in line with the general secularization or moves or pressure to secularize the Irish system, mostly from parents. Religious education, which was part of the 1999 primary curriculum, has now been replaced with religious, ethical, multi-belief and values education, and it's called the Patrons Program. So, for example, Educate Together School had developed, because they didn't want to teach religion during school hours, so they had a religious education program that was education about religion since their inception in 1978. And so they had developed their core curriculum, and which was an ethical and multi-belief program. And the same for the new school set up through the Education and Training Boards. They put in place a multi-belief program as well, although they try to provide religious instruction in different groups within school hours, which wasn't the case in Educate Together School, where they insisted it was better to have it outside of school hours. So that's an evolution in terms of the secularization of the system, and can impact migrants as well. Right, so moving on to specific education policies. So as I mentioned before, travelers have been used as inspiration to migrant integration policies. And so when travelers were encouraged to join mainstream schools, you had specific support systems put in place, and you had resource teachers for travelers. So basically they were in a mainstream class, and they had some support hours with the resource teacher for travelers, usually to provide support in English and maths, like the core subjects for the primary curriculum. And another targeted intervention that I will not go into today, but I wanted to mention because it's a similar specific policy, is to reduce inequalities. You've had since 2005 a plan that's called Delivering Equality of Opportunity in Schools. And so some schools get targeted support as well, so for different criteria. It's also interesting because as migrants tend to settle in disadvantaged areas, it means that some of them might avail of those. Well, you have two sides of this aspect. They're in schools that already have a high amount of difficulties, but at the same time, there are schools that have additional funding and additional support to take into account the difficulties that those schools are already facing. So, so this has an impact on migrant integration. So more specifically for migrant support, before the 1990s, there was very limited specific support or no support for immigrant pupils. But so you had a few, you had in 1956, I think you had some refugees from Hungary, but they weren't very numerous. There wasn't much support for them. You had some English language support for refugees from Vietnam who arrived in early 1979. So you had some experience with refugees, but it was very limited. And other migrants had no support at all. It was just for program refugees because that was part of the contract, I suppose, on welcoming them to Ireland. And so that changed in the 2020s. So you had investment in English language support, which then became called English as an additional language. And interestingly enough, and as a transition for the second presentation today, it started again with asylum seekers, although it's actually applied to all migrant children. But the impetus came from the reception of asylum seekers. And so in 2000, you had an information booklet for schools on asylum seekers that was published. And it explained that, or it put in place a system whereby schools could get an English language support teacher if they had at least 15 pupils or more who needed support in English, so whose home language or whose first language wasn't English. And if they had fewer than 14 pupils, which was the case of many schools because you didn't have that many migrant pupils at the time, they got a grant to pay for teachers to come for a few hours to give support. And then in 2001, so you had a body that's it's a private organization, but that's non-profit and under the responsibility of the Department of Education, that was called Integrate Ireland Language and Training, and which was actually the result of a merger between two entities which were working for with asylum seekers in the past. And so they were in charge of providing EL support and training for migrants. You had targeted intervention in the early 2000s. And so that peaked in 2007, just before the financial crisis hit Ireland and the rest of the world. And so you had a maximum of 6 language support posts for schools with over 121 migrant pupils, which shows that you had concentration, or you had a higher proportion of migrant pupils in some schools compared to others. If you think the average, I mean, you have very small primary schools in Ireland. Most of them have about 200 pupils. And the biggest ones might have 500, 600 or 800 pupils. So if you reach a stage where you have 121 migrants, it means it's a much higher proportion in that school than in other schools in Ireland. So you had a Department of Education, at the time, Education and Science Circular, to offer more support in English for migrants. But that was the peak, and then the financial crisis arrived and put an end to, or at least limited that support. And so you had cuts in the late 2000s, well, basically after 2007, in specific support, both for travelers and migrant children. In 2008, Integrate Ireland Language and Training closed following budget cuts because they were mostly funded by the Department of Education. And then 2009, you had a reduction in English as an additional language post. So the maximum was 2 per school and 4 if for schools who really had over 121 pupils in need of language support. And there was a value for money report also to recommend the integration of all support funding into a global model, which means that it's also the model used for all pupils in primary schools who need support in maths and English, etc. So they've tried to integrate all types of support into one common model. So those are just preliminary conclusions because I haven't, well, I'm going to explain, but basically what we can say for today is that there's been a mix, of course, of mainstream and specific education policies. It's not one or the other. They were happening at the same time. But it's true that the recent trend seems to be to have cuts in specific support policies for migrants or other minority groups alike. And so this raises the question of the impact on migrant children, because on the one hand, withdrawal from the mainstream classrooms for support was seen as potentially stigmatizing migrant children or special needs children, and there were recommendations to better integrate them by providing support inside the classroom. But at the same time, this raises the question of the efficiency of that support. I mean, there's less stigmatization within the classroom, but can it be as effective as a specific targeted hours outside of that classroom? So there are still something I need to look into. There has been research on this, but I haven't looked into that in detail for the time being. But is mainstreaming or is mainstreaming going to have a positive or negative impact on the integration of migrant children is an open question for today. But the rationale behind mainstreaming wasn't to better integrate migrants. It was mostly to cut costs. So it's not clear what the impact is going to be. And so I wanted, as a transition to Barbara, to end on refugees. What I've said was true up until COVID in 2022. But Ireland has agreed to receive a significant number of Ukrainian refugees following the invasion of Russia. And it seems to be a temporary exception or a continuation of the specific target measures put in place for refugees in Irish history. It's always been the case since they have received so since the 1950s, since they have received refugees. And so it was striking how different the measures put in place to welcome Ukrainian refugees were to the ad hoc measures of the 2000s. And so in the Department of Education put in place regional education and language teams, and they're based in the education and training boards that I've mentioned and that have taken more significance recently because they managed a new multinational community national school set up by the Department of Education. And so they have to coordinate the education needs of children from Ukraine arriving in Ireland. So specific education policies still exist, but whether it's only a temporary exception for Ukrainian refugees, and some people are already, or I think the government has announced that they were going to withdraw some of the specific measures. So that's the question or the note I wanted to end on to hand over to Barbara.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I will share. Where is my sharing?
It's perfect. It's working fine.
Yeah, but I prefer having it as a. It's just that the thing is underneath this. Hang on just a second. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay, thank you. Right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today and enabling me to go back. I've been working on something else for the last few years, and I'm now going back to what was my first, I suppose, focus in my research, particularly in my DUA and then in my PhD, which was the reception of asylum seekers and refugees in Ireland and government policy. So This is what I'm going to be looking at today. The reason why it's particularly, I think, relevant to look at it today is, as I will explain later, I did some research on, I had a kind of a case study based section in my thesis where I looked at particular policies through cases. And one of those was the reception accommodation of asylum seekers around the country. And the case I studied was of a very small village in County Tipperary, a small rural village, and how things went there. And I'm seeing a lot of parallels now, 24 years later. And so I've decided to try to establish some comparisons and see what has changed, if anything, what needs to still, change. So that's what I'm going to be looking at today. Okay. So just before we start, I just want to explain very briefly for those of you who may not be familiar with how asylum seekers are received in Ireland for the last 25 years. It's a system called the direct provision system. So I'm just going to give you just a few words on that. This system was introduced in the year 2000. Until then, asylum seekers who arrived in Ireland were given social welfare benefits, and they found their own accommodation. They had rent allowance and the same kind of social welfare allowances as Irish people, but the numbers increased significantly. They all wanted to be in Dublin, and there was a kind of an accommodation crisis. So the government decided, when the UK government decided to clamp down and start a kind of a cashless system, the Irish government didn't want Ireland to become a kind of an attractive destination, let's say, and decided to kind of follow in that path as well. So they introduced the direct provision system in 2000. Where asylum seekers are dispersed around the country. They are put up in accommodation centres with full board, which means a canteen or some form of thing like that in wherever they're living. Because they're getting accommodation and full board, they're no longer eligible for supplementary welfare allowances, and they were given nominal weekly cash allowance per adult and per child. At the time, it was 15 euros per adult per week, well, 15 pounds as it was at the time, just before the euro, and 7.50 per child. It's now gone up to, 25 years later, it's gone up to the princely sum of 39 euros 80 per adult and 25-ish, 24.80 or something per child. So still very, very small numbers. So the government decided to publish ads in local newspapers and national newspapers, asking people who may have appropriate accommodation, hotels that were not being used, disused convents, army barracks, mobile home sites, things like that, if they wanted to, have a contract with the Irish government to provide accommodation. And this became a kind of a business at the time, with a lot of for-profit companies buying disused hotels or leasing them and providing this service and making a lot of money, untaxed, because a lot of it was in offshore accounts and things like that. So as a result of that, I'll talk about that later, but the conditions, it was a for-profit system, which meant that it wasn't always in the best interests of the residents. So when the government started sending people around the country, there was some resistance. So what I'm going to do is to talk to you about one particular village where things got pretty tense, and this is a village that the case was all over the media for a couple of weeks, And I went down maybe 9 months later and spent a few days down there, 3-4 days down there, stayed in a B&B and just spent those 3 days talking to local people and trying to understand from their point of view, you know, how they saw it and how things were going 9 months later. So I'm just going to very briefly outline what happened in Clogheen. Now, Clogheen is a small village in County Tipperary, 400 inhabitants, 1 grocery shop, 4 pubs, no park, no sports or leisure facilities. So really, really basic. So what happened was, and this was all told to me, you know, 9 months later by the local priest, who received a phone call 4 days before the planned arrival of 40 asylum seekers, April 2000. The Department of Justice phoned and said, Father, we're sending 40 people down to your village. Could you please talk to your parishioners and, quote, get the ball rolling, unquote. And that was the extent of consultation or planning with the local population. There was no prior consultation or preparation with local elected officials who didn't hear about it, with the social services, doctor, the school who would be required to, you know, take in the children. None of these people. So the priest announced it 2 days later at Mass, and they arranged to have a town meeting. And this was at a time where the media were it was beginning to get very hostile, with a lot of, you know, floods of asylum seekers, you know, spongers, bogus asylum seekers, and all of this kind of language was going in the kind of the more populist media, and a few kind of more populist politicians, you know, were using this kind of language. So there was a kind of a fertile ground for hostility. So at that public meeting, which was just the local people with the priest, and you know, there were questions like, who are these people? Are they rapists? Are they pedophiles? This has all been documented in local newspaper articles. You know, were they rapists, pedophiles, murderers? Were they carrying infectious diseases? These kind of things. So a lot of you know, very hostile and racist kind of fear. Well, you know, fears and kind of prejudices being expressed there. So the priest came out of that meeting with a small group of people who formed a committee, and they decided to contact the government, again, the government department, and say to them, look, you need to come and meet the people in the village and give them some information so that they know what's happening. So the government officials said, okay, we can meet them. Just to give you the kind of culture in the department, they said, we can meet them, but we can't come to Clogheen. We propose meeting them in the town of Cahir, which was about 20 miles away, because the roads to Clogheen are too bad. So the priest very quickly told them that they better get themselves down pretty quickly to the village, which they did. And the meeting, a few hours before the meeting took place with local officials and with even more media at the time, 2 or 3 hours before the meeting, there was an arson attack on the hotel in the town, in the main street of the town, that was supposed to be taking in asylum seekers 2 or 3 days later.
Barbara, sorry to interrupt you, but your slide is stuck on the first one. We can't see them actually. Yeah, we haven't seen any of them yet.
I'm on number 5. Oh
yeah,
dear.
okay, well.
Okay, so can you see that? Is that moving?
No, it's still stuck actually.
Okay, why don't I stop and start again? I'm sorry about that. I've been moving on, so it's
sorry about the interruption.
No, you're right to interrupt me. Okay, let me see. Okay, I will. Where am I? I've got several things open here. Just a second. I'm not on my computer. I'm in a university computer. So I will close that. And I will, if it doesn't work, I'll just leave it as the, I'll leave it as that maybe. Okay. Oh, what have I done? Okay. Right, so I'll try and share this again. Can you see that?
Yeah, the first one, yes.
Okay, so if I may just leave it like that and just go.
No, that's fine, yeah.
Like that, rather than do
yes,
this. That might be where the problem is, okay?
Okay,
so,
fine.
That was the direct provision
Cheers.
explanation, initial I was here, okay? So the meeting took place with the department officials. The questions were asked, obviously some of the hostile questions were asked, but some practical questions, like would the local school get any additional support from the Department of Education? Would language classes be provided? Would extra health and social services be provided? Given that, they were planning to bring in the equivalent of 10% extra of the population. The department officials were unable to give any specific answers and gave a very, the impression to everybody present that nothing was really planned. And according to journalists present at the time, they made a hasty retreat when it came to the time to have a cup of tea and a sandwich because the crowd was extremely angry, and so they left. So what happened was there was a kind of a negotiation. They couldn't, because of the arson attack, they couldn't take in the planned asylum seekers the following day. So it was put off for a few weeks while repairs were made in the hotel, and the committee that was created in the village went up to Dublin and negotiated with the Department of Justice and said, okay, we will take in some, but we want to reduce it from 40 to 15. And initially they said no, and in the end they said yes, and they committed, which I find very strange, they gave a commitment in the department to the committee that they would give them 15 hand-picked, quote unquote, people, giving I suppose a kind of almost like a veto to the local villages at a time where you had similar protests in a lot of other villages around Ireland, who were watching carefully to see what was happening here. Anyway, what happened there was 3 weeks later, 15 people arrived. The committee, which was there initially, to kind of resist it, turned into the Claheen Welcome Committee, and these people were welcomed into the community, and the children went to school, and everything went okay. Although it was such an isolated place that when I went down 9 months later, some of the people who'd originally came had managed to obtain transfers to bigger towns locally, like Limerick and places like that. And the local people in the village said, yeah, everything is fine. We don't really see them anymore. So all of the kind of the meeting and the organizing cultural exchange activities and everything had kind of waned, and, everybody was just getting on with their lives, but there was no more hostility. So that example was replicated very much, apart from the arson part of it, was replicated in small villages and towns across the country in the year 2000, 2001. And what came out from all of them was the lack of consultation on the part of the Department of Justice, the Reception and Integration Agency, as they were called at the time. And when asked several years later, why do you, but to say in Claheen, they arrived later and they were promised, we will inform you when these 15 people are coming. And the bus arrived one day, no notice given to anybody so that they even would be there to welcome them. So, all the way through, there was no keeping their word or consulting or giving any kind of notice of anything happening. So this happened for several years, where it was almost, you know, dispersal by ambush. And this was something that was particularly problematic because it gave, I think it gave people the impression that the Department of Justice were hiding something because there was something to hide. Okay. Now, an official who was interviewed for a report several years later and asked why, you know, why do you not consult the local population more? And there was a quote saying, if you go, and I read it here on my slide, if you go to the community initially, there's all sorts of opposition being vocalized and voiced about it, and the politicians get involved in it, and everybody wants something done, but not in their backyard. You know, it's that kind of scenario. So that leads us to the position where we have to just go and get stuff and, you know, get it up and running pretty much before anybody kind of knows anything about it. And that pretty much, in the words of that official, pretty much sums up how in the last 20 years, the Department of Justice has gone about setting up new reception centres for asylum seekers. Initially, they were saying, look, we have to do this, it's an emergency, there are huge numbers of people, but then after 2007, when numbers went down, it still continued, this kind of lack of consultation. The problem is that it kind of, it gives a lot of, you know, it can stoke fear in a way, because people are saying, you know, are they trying to hide something or give us the impression that these people are undesirable, and so they're going to give them to us before we can even say no. So that's a kind of a, you know, the lack of consultation and the kind of springing things on people and the lack of information and everything, combined with an existing prejudice in small communities, it turned out to be quite a lethal cocktail. Another thing that continued over 25 years, despite showing its weaknesses, was the choice of location. Very often, people were being sent to very remote places, like Clogheen, as I said, but in other very remote places, you know, with very little in terms of public services, very little public transport. These are people who would need to travel from time to time to Dublin for administrative purposes, things like asylum interviews, when their applications are being examined. These are people who, until very recently, were not allowed to work while their applications were being examined. So they had nothing to do, and there was nothing to do in the places where they were. So there was a lot of depression. People were staying, initially they were supposed to stay for about 6 months, but very many people were staying 5-6 years in these places because their applications were taking such a long time to be examined. Another thing was the numbers being sent into very small communities was really creating a situation where it was probably more difficult to integrate. When the case of Clogheen I quoted there, 400 people in the village, 40 asylum seekers, so that's the equivalent of 10%. 18 years later in Moville, County Donegal, population 1,400, they sent 100 asylum seekers, and even more, a bigger, I think, proportion was in Ruski, County Leitrim, population 564, they sent 80 asylum seekers, which is really an enormous number of, you know, people to suddenly arrive into these villages. So those were two of the things that I saw, and what happened also was that these people were dispersed, and then the local community, the local service providers, were left pretty much to their own devices. There was no support from the centralised authorities in Dublin. So 20 years, 24 years even after the introduction of direct provisions, we didn't hear very much about it for, you know, it was very tense for the first few years, 2000 to 2002, and then things kind of quietened down, and then suddenly in about 2018, things started repeating themselves again. And I think that what surprises me or disappoints me in a way, I suppose, is every time I read reports about what is happening in what's been happening in the last few years, is I really say, wow, nothing has changed since I studied it. So the direct provision system has been studied and researched ad nauseum in the last 20 years, and every single report written about it talks about the terrible effects it has on residents, and you know, the human rights issues about the treatment, the inappropriate treatment, and that the government wasn't really fulfilling its obligations under international law for the reception of asylum seekers. An expert advisory group was created and published a report for the government on reform of the process and reform of the accommodation of international protection applicants, which is the name now used for asylum seekers. And they recommended ending direct provision. In 2021, a white paper to end direct provision was published by the government, and the proposal was to end direct provision by 2024, in other words, this year, and in its place to move away from contracting out to private for-profit companies who were running these hotels and other such centres, and instead having purpose-built, larger scale, government-owned and run accommodation centres. So there would be no profit. And this was supposed to be on the way until, I suppose, everything changed in 2022. The invasion of Ukraine meant that large numbers of Ukrainians were arriving in Ireland since February 2022. So in 2 years, Ireland has received over 100,000 Ukrainians, which proportionately is quite significant. After many years of low numbers, relatively low numbers, 3,000, 4,000 a year of international protection applicants coming in, suddenly it started rising in 2019, almost 5,000, and then 2020, 2021 with COVID, nobody was coming in. It was 1,000 or 2,000 because of COVID and borders being closed. And suddenly then 2022, 2023, over 13,000 every year. So you've got all these people coming in, needing to be accommodated. Some direct provision residents who were already in the system, who were granted refugee status or some other form of leave to remain, and who were therefore allowed to leave direct provision and get their own, they would be entitled to social welfare payments and be able to go and rent their own accommodation. But due to the huge housing crisis in Ireland at the moment and high numbers of homeless people, a lot of the direct provision residents who are entitled to leave cannot. So they're staying there. So the most recent figure I have for the number of residents in direct provision centres all around Ireland is 26,092, and that was up from 10,000. So it's like 2.5 times more than it was a year previously. So needless to say, the plan, the timetable of ending direct provision this year is out the window for the moment, because they need all the centres that they have, and they need to open even more because they don't have enough accommodation for all the people who are coming in. So the reaction to that was looking for new places, and there have been a lot of protests nationwide. I just have some photos here of protests. Top left is East Wall in the Dublin inner city, where a disused what was it, some form of a factory or some kind of industrial / office space was going to be converted, and was housing asylum seekers. Top right is down in Rosslare, Enough is Enough. They had a picket on a place which was being renovated to house asylum seekers. Top left and bottom left and right, Ross Cray, there was a hotel there, which was the owner of the hotel signed a contract with the Irish government to take in people, and the people of Rosslare were against it and put up a very strong and well-attended picket for a number of days and even weeks. So the reasons given for the protests by people being interviewed both in the media, the print media and television and radio, well, probably the most prominent one is the question of security. People, the kind of the expression unvetted single men or unvetted single men of a military age, which is quite a familiar, far right trope, internationally. This has become kind of normalized, where people are saying, who are these people? They're unvetted males. We don't want these people coming into our community. First of all, there was a distinction at first made between asylum seekers, the international protection applicants, and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were taken in. They were welcomed with open arms. There were lots of very positive integration measures put in place locally, with committees and people providing English lessons, a lot of voluntary groups, created or existing ones, welcoming them. But increasingly after about a year, anybody who came from Ukraine, well, if there were women and children, that would be okay. But if a man came from Ukraine, he'd be told to go back and fight, that he had nothing to do in Ireland. So this general protest then was, we didn't want unvetted single men. Sometimes that would mean that to diffuse the tension, that there would be some form of negotiation, and that in the end, mothers with children were sent instead, small family groups instead of the males. The other reason given for protests was the unsuitability of the location, either because it's too remote. They said, what are the people going to do here? There's nothing for them to do, even if they have the right to work after 6 months, which is now has been introduced in the last few years in Ireland. There are no jobs locally because it's such a remote location. There are no services for these people, so they're just going to be hanging around. And what do they do if they're hanging around? And we don't want them hanging around, in the main street of our village or whatever. Another reason about the unsuitability was, that sometimes the building being given over to accommodate these people would be the only communal building in the village, the only hotel. So they said, look, this is the only, economic unit we have in our village to have tourists, so that means tourism is out, or if people come to visit, we'd have none of these people. Or in some cases they were saying, this is the only place we have locally to organize weddings or receptions and particular family occasions. And the usual lack of consultation with the local community, particularly in a context where resources were already stretched. Now, the protests are pretty much all around the country, but arson attacks have become more and more common as well. Since 2018, when the two centres I mentioned, where over significant numbers in Donegal and in Leitrim, there were arson attacks in those villages. Since 2018, there have been 23 arson attacks. But since January, in the last year, there have been 16 incidents in all, 8 of which were in Dublin, but they are spread, as you can see from this map, pretty much around the country. And this brings it very much to another level, because there is tension, but when places are being burnt down, questions are being asked about who is behind this. So The government discourse was initially, you know, this is just a small group of people from outside, members of the far right coming in from England, you know, provoking all of this and kind of infiltrating, you know, small groups of harmless villagers who are just protesting. So, you know, nothing to worry about, etc. But we need to get rid of these people from outside. However, with time, the Irish police and government officials, often off the record, you know, tell journalists that they think that mostly they are local individuals rather than these organized hierarchical groups of, you know, far right groups coming in from outside doing it. Now, these people, and this is the big difference for me with what happened in 2000, is we now have social media, so communication is much easier, and any kind of tension, any hostility is really magnified as a result of people communicating on social media. A lot of misinformation can be sent in by people from the outside, you know, to incite local people who might be frustrated, you know, incite them to act violently. Now, until last autumn, the Irish police were criticised very much by a lot of groups who were saying, you know, that it's kind of non-interventionist. Look, you know, if we don't intervene, maybe it'll just all fizzle out. You know, it might provoke things even more if we get involved and, you know, try to in some way deal with protests. They just used to keep an eye on until there were some very violent riots in Dublin city centre last November, following a stabbing attack by a man with Irish nationality, but who was of Algerian origin, and this went out on social media, and Dublin was like the kind of the images we were getting were the kind of images that people get in the international media when Paris or any of the banlieue are burning in France, and that was the kind of the image going around the world of that. So suddenly the Irish police have begun to investigate, and they're infiltrating online groups, etc. And there are, there is, you know, influence and things like that from extreme right groups, but you know, some of the people are very much local. So just to conclude, well, what has changed? To be perfectly honest, very little, except from the government point of view, in my opinion. The rise of the far right in Ireland, for many years, I was saying that this was a micro phenomenon and that nothing was really happening. However, in the last year or so, several anti-immigration parties have registered and are planning apparently to field candidates in the local elections and the European elections in June. There are three parties there: Irish Freedom Party, the National Party, and the Ireland First. Now, these will probably be very small parties. However, in the upcoming, and this is just to finish briefly because I know I'm running out of time, a very recent survey about 2-3 weeks ago questioned people about the local elections and its proportional representation. Who would they give their number twos to? And 36% of Sinn Féin voters said that they would support anti-immigration candidates. Now, given that, or give them a number two vote. Now, given that in the last elections, a lot of left-wing members of parliament in the Irish Parliament got in on transfers from number two votes from Sinn Féin candidates. There is a chance now, or there is a fear now, that maybe some of these transfers might go to anti-immigration candidates, and that we may unfortunately see for the first time an anti-immigration candidate or you know, succeeding in getting elected in Ireland.
Many thanks for two extremely stimulating and complementary talks, actually. And I'm sure there'll be some questions from the floor, but I might actually start with one question, which I think I may ask both Patricia and Barbara. And you actually mentioned, Barbara, you mentioned these small localities where the asylum seekers were actually, located actually by the, or they were directed at least towards these areas like Moville or Ruxey. I wanted to know, I presume that these areas were not particularly diverse prior to the arrival of these asylum seekers?
Well, what's interesting, if you look at the census results now and look at the spread of people who were not born in Ireland, it's pretty much, what is fascinating about Ireland is it's pretty much spread. Unfortunately, I don't have a map here. It's spread very much around. It's not totally centralized on the big cities. Many towns and villages have immigrant workers, because of, as a result of the boom, and people came, and a lot of them stayed even though after the crash, but things are back moving again. So there are so many communities around the country where there are people, but I think it's the scale. I think it's a question of scale. If you have a small village of 400 and you've got maybe 2 or 3 families, it works. But if you've got a whole block of people who come in and who can't work, and there are no activities, I think that was one of the problems, was that integration was, is difficult because these people are inactive, and they don't have any money, so they can't, go out and spend money. They have nothing, it's very difficult. Honestly, the only integration that happens in a lot of cases is through the school, parents meeting parents, and the local Gaelic Athletics Association, the local football and hurling clubs, which are big, what would you say, foyer d'intégration, are big, places where integration happens.
Because that was going to be my question for Patricia, which was about the geographical, distribution of migrants in Ireland. My assumption until today was that the vast majority of migrants were centered in the Dublin area, and that there were very few actually immigrants outside Dublin, or maybe other, urban centers like, I don't know, Galway or other places, but maybe I'm wrong. So.
Thank you. Actually, for when I did my fieldwork for my dissertation, that was between 2005 and 2008, and I wanted to get out of Dublin. So I had 2 schools in Dublin, one Catholic, one Church of Ireland, and the other schools were in big urban centers outside of Dublin. They were anonymous. But and so no, you had migrants in all big urban centers, and then you had sometimes just higher numbers of migrants if they had employment there. For example, meat factories, which were in rural areas, had Brazilian migrants because they had been hired by the meat factory locally, and so you would have just because of employment reasons, as Barbara mentioned, a higher number of migrants in a place you wouldn't expect to find them, just because of the employment opportunities that were there. And from Asia, you had migrants working in the healthcare sector, and that spread everywhere. Those who were working, like, for example, in one of the schools I studied, you had a significant number of Malaysian migrants and Filipino migrants, and some of the women tended to work in the healthcare sector, and that's not restricted to Dublin.
Any other questions from the floor? Sonia.
Yes, thank you. I have a question for Patricia. I'd like to know, so you said, probably, if I heard you correctly, that there are almost 2% Muslim students in the Irish education system at the primary level. So how well would you say these students are included in the denominational Irish school system? And is there a controversy or something like resistance to religious symbols like the headscarf as we have in France, for instance? Thank you.
There's a book I haven't mentioned by I'll write his name there. Maybe his name is Youssef Sai, and he's done his PhD in Trinity, I think, in Dublin, on the Muslim community, but I think more specifically on the Muslim. Have 2 Muslim schools in Dublin, and his work was on their religious education program, Islamic religious education, and so you have some information there. But basically, what's interesting is that the model in Ireland was to open a denominational school, right, for all communities in a way. That was the inheritance from not from the 19th century, because originally there was supposed to be mixed schools, but that's how it evolved. And so that's why the first Muslim was opened. And the second that opened created more tensions, and they were perceived as more traditional, and there was more criticism. Now, as to the, and so I think this has been normalized because the second school now has approximately the same number as the first school. And at some point they had decreasing numbers because even, I shouldn't say even, but Muslim parents were not satisfied with the way the school was, or the religious, the way the religious education classes were taught, because what happens in Ireland as elsewhere is that the Muslim community is very diverse. You have Muslim from different countries, from different traditions, Shia and Sunni, and so there's diversity. That means that there's even tension within the school, depending on the approach that's taken, because the religious education teachers come from the outside, they're not trained in the Irish education system, etc. And so there are tensions on that level. Now, as to the headscarf, because basically outside of the 2 Muslim schools in Dublin, Muslim children tend to attend Catholic schools, first because they're the local schools, and they don't necessarily know that there's a Church of Ireland school down the road that might have places for them and be less religious. But at the same time, you still have something that's going to supposedly be phased out in Ireland, is single-sex schools. And so that's something that has fitted Muslim well, that you have the girls' school and the boys' school, and they're educated separately. And you have that in a lot of even urban centers, like all the schools, new schools would be co-educational. We still have a lot of single-sex schools in Ireland, and also because they're Catholic schools, religion is part of the school day. And so on some level, when I visited the schools, I felt that there might have been some tensions and racism towards Muslim pupils or other migrant pupils, but in terms of the headscarf, it was something that made sense within a denominational system. You have a religion, it's part of your school day. I was part of the Catholic school day, so it made sense that Muslim children would also have their religion during the school day, which is completely different to the system in France, where religion is supposed to be a private matter that you don't bring to school. But from a Catholic school point of view, with the crucifix on the wall, on the statue of the Virgin Mary in the entrance, wearing a headscarf is just part of your religion and who you are. And apart from the fact that they had to attend sometimes religious classes at the back of the class and draw, do something else, etc., or attend language support classes at the time devoted to religious education so that they didn't have to attend it. There weren't that many tensions from what I observed in my field work over almost 20 years ago.
Can I just interrupt? I'm really sorry. I'm giving doing the webinar in a classroom, and there's a teacher waiting at the door and has an exam for her students.
Okay.
I'm going to have to leave you. I'm so sorry, because this is the interesting part. I'll watch the discussion afterwards when the video goes online. If anybody has any questions.
Many thanks in any case.
Okay.
Understand.
See you soon, Bairbre.
Bye.
Yeah, it was precisely the question I was going to ask about the, attitudes to non-Christian religions. You might expect, you might expect exactly what you described, given the sense that, there is no such thing as secular schools, as far as I understand. Although I understand there was a movement that started in the 1990s. There's been a movement towards creating schools that are not denominational.
It's from 1970. It's a group of parents in Dublin, because they were attending a Church of Ireland school that had that also had Catholic children. At some point, the school said, we have no places left, and we're going to prioritize Church of Ireland children. And so parents, and also it was in the 1970s, you had the Civil War in Northern Ireland, and they felt it was important to educate Protestant and Catholic children together. And some of them were humanists, so were atheists, so had no religion. And so they managed to have one school recognized. And it was slow during the 1980s, but from the end of the 1990s, they had better funding from the Department of Education. Because traditionally the churches had to bring the building, the site, and a local contribution, which parents could not do. Well, they had to take loans, etc. But then those rules were relaxed, and the Department of Education now funds the school building, is the owner of the school, etc. So they've been able to develop a lot since 2000 approximately. And so those schools are multi-denominational. At first, they tried to accommodate religious instruction within the school day just because it was more convenient for parents. But they realized that this created tension with children who had no religious education in the school, or religious instruction, I should say. And so they've moved religious instruction where it's provided on school premises outside of the school time. So they had to define themselves as multi-denominational because there was no way the Department of Education was going to recognize a non-denominational school in the primary system at the time. And also because they wanted to be seen as inclusive, and not the idea that non-denominational secular, as we have in French, would be, how should I put it, against all religions. And so they wanted to insist on the fact that they would welcome all religions and none, and not try to exclude religion, but their religious program was education about religions and different festivals and citizenship discussions, etc. But no religious instruction within the school hour, and so they're mostly secular. I mean, I visited them for my master one, which was maîtrise back then in 2002 and 2003. I visited for. And of course, to franchise, there's still a fair amount of religion, but to Irishize, it's a fairly secular model,
Okay.
Which is different from the one set up by the Department of Education, where they tried to include religious instruction within the school days, and when you had tensions, because you had to separate pupils based on religion, so that they attended different classes depending on their religion during the school day.
Do you have any other questions? I was wondering about statistics myself, and I was wondering when, because you mentioned statistics in relation to religious affiliation, and I was wondering when they were introduced in the first place, and two, when I think they also have statistics in relation to nationality or ethnicity, and I wanted to know whether they'd been inspired by the so-called British model, because these statistics were actually introduced in the UK in the 1990s. So,
for religious affiliation, I haven't checked recently, but I think it's as old as 1871. So it dates back from the Union and from 19th century censuses, possibly because it was an important issue in Ireland, and so it came in earlier than in other places in Britain, I think. I'm not sure when it was in the UK, but Ireland.
Well, yeah, religious statistics were introduced prior to after statistics about nationality or ethnicity were introduced. So in 2001, they were introduced in 2001.
Okay, no, so it's much older in Ireland.
From the Muslim, or in sections of the Muslim community in the UK.
Okay, to have greater visibility. Yeah. But for ethnicity, you're right, it's approximately the same period. I think it's 2002, the first time that the ethnicity question was asked. Before that, it was nationality or place of birth. Okay. So you had statistics about where people were born. Right. And you have a nationality, and they've changed it for the 22 census. Now they've transformed nationality into citizenship, I think. Okay. It's a new item. So it's now citizenship rather than nationality, but still have place of birth and ethnicity.
Okay. Many thanks. So do we have other questions? If not, I suppose we'll call it a day. We'll thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and for these presentations that were very interesting, that you'll be able to access online shortly in the coming, the next few days, I suppose. And it's time for us to announce the next webinar, which will be held on Friday, the 22nd of March. That will be a panel organized by Karine Tournier-Sol from Université de Toulon and Émilie De Witt, who is a doctoral student at Sorbonne Nouvelle. And there'll be two participants, Aurélien Mondon from the University of Bath, will be talking about populism, public opinion, and the mainstreaming of the far right, the immigration issue and the construction of a reactionary people. And the second participant will be Katie Brown from Maynooth University. We'll be talking about the mainstreaming of the far right in the media, reporting, enabling, or countering, question mark. So thanks a lot, and see you in 11 days now time for this new session. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.